We will go directly to our next keynote talk given by Andreas Wallraff. He is a full professor for solid-state physics at the ETH in Zurich. And there he focuses on experiments, investigation of quantum effects in superconducting circuits, as well as performing very fundamental quantum optics experiments, which are really exciting. Recently, his group published great results on the implementation of surface code with up to 17 superconducting qubits. And today, Andreas will present on quantum error correction in general. So, Andreas, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me see whether my slideshow shows what it should be showing. Does it? Yeah, I do see, but maybe you guys see something else on your technique. I did the extension. I could also just duplicate. Am I on the wrong plug? That could be one of the reasons. Yeah, there were two HDMI cables. 50-50 chance, let's see. Good. Yeah, now it seems to recognize that there's something on the back end. Ah, okay, good. There, I also see it's still on the duplicate side. Okay, good. Let me try this. Yeah. No. Good. Let me see. That's when there's too much sophistication in the audiovisual equipment. That does happen. It also happens in our lecture halls at ETH. So let me try the one set less sophistication here, which leads to less troubles. Good. Here we go. All right. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in Munich and present our work on superconducting circuits. It's an experiment that we're quite happy about. We worked on it for a long time. Yeah, we started probably 6 years ago or so. There was lots of competition. Essentially, everybody wants to implement error correction on a larger scale superconducting circuits, obviously all the academic labs and also all the big IT companies like Google and IBM. So let me see how I position myself and whether my pointing works. Yeah, here we go. Maybe this looks more familiar to me than just looking directly at my screen. All right, so the title of my talk is Quantum Error Correction with Superconducting Circuits. It's been done with a team of experimentalists at ETH Zurich, so they're listed here. It's really a team effort, so lots of people have contributed. As I said, we've worked 6 years on it. There are then two who were really in the lead for pushing the experiment across the finish line, and that's Sebastian Krinner, a postdoc, and Nathan Lacroix, a young graduate student. But we've also collaborated, in addition, very successfully with a group of Alexandre Blais, who's at the University of Sherbrooke, who's really a long-time collaborator with our lab, and also with Markus Müller at RWTH Aachen. And since it's also quite technical, I'd like to thank our technical team as well. And then also, good things take time. So this experiment took 6 years, but we're also at ETH since now more than 15 years. And so quite a few people have contributed to our lab during those, and maybe some in the audience recognize their names somewhere on the list. So there's Anna Stockklauser, who will be on the discussion session tomorrow, I guess, who's at Rigetti now, was a grad student in our lab. Who else? So there's Stefan Philipp, who's a speaker tomorrow, was a postdoc in our lab. There's Philipp Korpiers, maybe somewhere in the back, who was a grad student in our lab. And if you now look at it, there's quite a few faculty members all over the world who did some work in our lab, and the rest is sort of distributed equally among kind of technology companies in the quantum realm, and also sort of small and big startups. So that's nice to see, and we're very thankful for everyone who's contributed to our lab throughout the last 15 years or so. Good. So, why quantum error correction? So maybe I guess all of you remember this breakthrough result from Google. Now maybe 3 years back, it's this quantum computational advantage experiment. That was really impressive, and it still is really impressive, I would say. They had 53 qubits on their device, which is shown here on the right-hand side. I think they had sort of state-of-the-art gate fidelities for single qubit and 2 qubit operations. And even though it's now 3 years ago, I think things improved somewhat, but I think this really represents the state-of-the-art still quite well. So, and what did they do at the time? They demonstrated an advantage in their little 53 qubit quantum computer over a conventional computer. Essentially, they picked a problem where the difference between how a quantum computer would perform and how a classical computer would perform is maximized to some degree. And this is very impressive. So they could run head-to-head the quantum computer against the classical computer. The challenge with it is, though, that the task that was looked at wasn't particularly useful. So they essentially ran a random gate set on their 53 qubits, and this creates a very difficult to predict and calculate, but random entangled state of all these 53 qubits, which is very hard to simulate on a conventional computer. So maybe one word about why is it that this is then hard, or why are more interesting questions, why does the gap between how the quantum computer does and the classical computer shrink for more interesting questions? That is mostly because more interesting questions typically have some logical structure to them. Yeah? And the fact that there is some logical structure to the problem and how you would solve it algorithmically gives the classical computer a better standing against the quantum computer. Essentially, this gap shrinks in between the performance of the two systems. So therefore, this may be not particularly interesting task. It still constituted a milestone because it was the first time when a quantum computer was doing something that was hard or maybe impossible to simulate on a classical computer. So clearly, 53 qubits is not enough for doing kind of non-error corrected quantum algorithms in the future that are interesting and not simulable because of this sort of shrinking gap when the problem is interesting. And also, in the end, you probably want a fault-tolerant universal quantum computer, one that doesn't suffer from the errors that your qubits suffer from. And what these errors are, I'll explain in a bit. So maybe let's talk a little bit more about, and this requires still quite a bit of advance in technology at all ends. So I think for scientists and students and research labs at large industries, so this means that there's probably lots of work ahead still at the current stage. So maybe to see a bit more why error correction might be needed is, let's take another look at this Google experiment. So on their device, 53 out of 54 qubits worked, which was quite nice. Here on the right-hand side, you see a picture of what that device schematically looked like. And that's sort of the level of detail that you get to look at the chip from Google these days. Yeah? So if you want to look at what the qubits look like, you have to kind of live with seeing a little cross that tells you the fidelity of the single qubit gate operations and the fidelities of the couplers between the two. So there were 53 out of 54 qubits were working. There was probably a qubit up here which didn't do its job. So the 2 qubit operations were all really quite good at a 1% fidelity level. The single shot qubit readout, the ability to read out the state of these qubits was a bit worse, maybe around 4%. And then what was implemented on this set of 53 qubits, essentially they executed pairwise 2 qubit gates. So between every one of these crosses, as much in parallel as possible. So essentially they paired up all the qubits, ran a 2 qubit gate between it in one time step, and then in the next time step they ran the next 2 qubit gate. And they did that for roughly 22 qubit gates in sequence. So you end up doing about 1,000 2 qubit gates on this device in sequence. and you add a few single qubit gates to it. And you create an outcome, and you do measure all your 53 qubits, and you ask yourself, okay, how well can you reconstruct that state or compare it to the target state that it should have been realizing, the quantum computer should have been realizing, and look at whether you could have simulated that target state on a conventional computer. And so now, and you compare how good that state is relative to the ideal state. If everything was perfect, if all the qubits were perfect, if all the gates were perfect, and you would, this ideality we would express as saying, okay, this state has a fidelity, and you wanted to have unit fidelity or 100% fidelity. So now on this experiment, the fidelity of that state was 10 to the minus 3. Yeah, so that's 0.1%. So the state that was produced was not very accurately produced, but it was still very hard to simulate that state nevertheless, even if there was maybe this state itself was reasonably far away from the ideal state. So in the end, if you want to use a quantum computer to calculate anything quantitatively, you want to do a quantum chemistry problem, for example, you want your problem also to be accurately solved. Yeah? And, it doesn't want to be solved only a little bit. Yeah? And so you have to deal with this problem here that when you have gate errors and that are partially induced by qubit decoherence, you probably have to mitigate them in some form to make sure that the final state that you create in your quantum computer is closer to the ideal state. And in this case, this was limited by a combination of the coherence times of their qubits, which were very good, and the gate fidelities that were limited by those coherence times, but also by control errors. So in the end, if you really want a quantum computer like that does universal quantum computation, I think many people would agree that it really has to be quantum error corrected. And that's actually very challenging to do. And the purpose of the talk today is to tell you sort of one of the fundamental steps of how to error correct your quantum computer. First, how you could possibly do it, and then how well it works. And then once you see how well it works, you will also see that there's still much work to be done. Okay, so nevertheless, I think there's probably two strands in quantum information processing generally, but also with superconducting circuits. One where you try to build the largest system that you could possibly build, take the largest number of qubits that you could get, and run some algorithm on it that is not quantum error corrected, and see whether that's interesting and where you would get with that. And this Google experiment is in this category. And then the other thread of work is probably realizing, okay, you probably need to error correct your quantum computer at some stage and try to go for that. And the problem with it is that for building error-corrected quantum computers, you will need to use a lot of physical qubits on your chip to encode a logical qubit on which you would do the error correction. So in some sense, it looks like, oh, you take a step back, yeah, because now maybe you use a device that has about 50 qubits, so every dot in this diagram here represents a qubit, and you would use all these 50 qubits to make one logical qubit that you can then error correct, and if you do that successfully, in the end, you have made use of these 50, and you have one logical qubit now. And with one logical qubit, we will likely not yet do anything interesting. You need then maybe 50 logical qubits to start doing something more interesting. Yeah? For example, repeating this Google experiment rather than with 50 physical qubits, with 50 logical qubits would be nice, but that would require many more qubits to do. 50 times 50 roughly, and maybe some more overhead. Okay, but these are the two strands that are followed in quantum computing with superconducting circuits. And so we're going to be talking about error correction and maybe a caveat for the experts. So there's maybe different ways how you could go to do quantum error correction in superconducting quantum computing systems. There's encodings that use qubits, where the quantum information is stored in a set of qubits, like of the physical qubits, like transpond qubits that we would build. And there's a different approach that tries to store quantum information in harmonic oscillator states. So that's so-called bosonic encoding. So this is also very interesting, and it's maybe at a similar state of affairs in its development, and it, for example, gets worked on at Yale and at many other places. So that I'll not talk about at all. So I'll not compare these two approaches in superconducting circuits to each other. Okay, so I told you a little bit why error correction is needed, yeah, and maybe one aspect that is special in correcting quantum errors in comparison to collecting classical errors, where you maybe classical errors, like when communication systems were not that great, you needed to correct classical communication errors, looking at when zeros change into ones and ones changes into zeros, and there's lots of sort of classical theory and implementations for dealing with these types of errors. And in quantum systems, there's not only one type of error, like a bit flip error that turns zeros into ones and ones into zeros, but there's also phase errors. So let's look at these bit flip errors first. Yeah? So in quantum computers, you represent the individual quantum states, for example, as vectors on a so-called Bloch sphere. So one of the things that you could do is you could identify the logical zero, or the physical, or the zero state of your quantum bit as the north pole on this Bloch sphere, and the one state of your quantum bit as the south pole of this Bloch sphere. And these two states are eigenstates of this so-called Pauli Z operator, which is representing the eigenstates of that operator are the basis states for your qubit. So one reason why you need quantum error correction is that any quantum system couples to the vacuum fluctuations of the electromagnetic field in its environment, and that the dipole interaction between that quantum system and this electromagnetic field sets the rate at which excited states decay to ground states. So the process in which this Bloch sphere vector pointing to the north pole flips back, pointing to the south pole flips back to pointing to the north pole. And that's unavoidable. Yeah, and in the early days of quantum computing, people were worried or so, is that the end of it already? That you would never get past this problem. And at the time, it was not so clear whether you could even come up with an approach to fix that problem. Yeah. And so it was really a major breakthrough to even theoretically realize that you could probably create an approach in which you could correct quantum errors successfully. And so that in itself is kind of pretty amazing, yeah, when you think about it. And I'll say a few more words about it later. So these bit flip errors, they don't only occur because of this coupling to the vacuum fluctuations and causing spontaneous emission of the qubit energy, but it could also be that zeros turn into ones because there's some little bit of thermal background, some thermal energy in the environment that brings qubits from the ground state to the excited state. And maybe even more importantly, and maybe at a place like this, and it's very important to notice that the quantum computer is in some sense an analog-driven machine, or so you apply analog control signals to it. And even if you do very well, and if you're at a company that knows about these things, you will still make mistakes, yeah? Small mistakes, but these small mistakes will matter. But quantum error correction can actually help you against these small mistakes that you make yourself as well. Okay, so and then one standard thing that you do in quantum physics to measure how likely it is that these ones turn into zeros, you measure the expectation value of this Pauli sigma z operator, which gives you sort of the average of the quantum state that you encode in a single physical qubit. And you'll see that decays from the south pole to the north pole at some rate, and that rate is typically expressed as an energy relaxation time, which for the physical qubits on our device is around 30 microseconds or so. So that's one type of error. So bits are flipping from 1 to 0, and maybe they get thermally excited from zeros to ones, and if you're not perfect in controlling everything, you will have control errors. So one type of errors. So there's a second type of errors, I mentioned it already, and those are so-called phase flips. So in quantum computers, you make use of coherent superpositions of zeros and ones, and there's two examples given here. So where you make a coherent superposition of a 0 plus 1 and one with 0 minus 1. And these states are eigenstates of the so-called Pauli X operator, yeah, and they point along this equator of this Bloch sphere here. And same thing could happen there. There's reasons why errors could occur. So errors could occur because something in your environment fluctuates. In many, for example, I don't know if you know a little bit of atomic physics or spin physics. Usually when you apply a magnetic field to a spin, and that magnetic field fluctuates, maybe because you have a neighbor who runs their elevator or does a quantum Hall experiment or so, then the transition frequency of your qubit varies a little bit, and that changes the phase of these superposition states that you see here. Or again, the electronics that you use has control inaccuracies, and then also if the one part of this state decays to the ground state, you'll also mess up this phase, and that is a phase flip. So what is special in these quantum computers that you have to correct for these two different types of errors, so bit flips and phase flips. So that makes it already more complicated in comparison to correcting classical errors in communications or in processing. And one way is to characterize how badly your superposition states are affected by these phase flips is to measure Ramsey decay times. So here's a Ramsey decay time measurement for one of our qubits. It shows these Ramsey oscillations, and the typical timescales are sort of 30 microseconds. All right, so these are the two types of errors that you want to be correcting in a quantum computer. And so the approach that I'll be discussing is to use a set of physical qubits. So here you see 49 of those to both encode your quantum information in a clever way in the red ones of these 49 qubits, and those are then called data qubits or code qubits, and use the green and blue ones essentially to help you to detect errors successfully. And as I'd mentioned, there's these two types of errors. There's sort of bit flips and phase flips. And the green and the blue auxiliary qubits, they help you to detect either one of these two types of errors. And then, once you will understand what this means. So these green and blue qubits, they implement so-called stabilizer measurements, but I'll explain to you what that really means. So one of the interesting thing about quantum error correction is this fact that when you have a physical qubit in a superposition state, 0 plus 1, when you go and measure it in its eigenbasis, in this Pauli Z basis, then that measurement destroys this superposition state. So a 0 plus 1 and you measure it, you will either get a 0 or 1, and afterwards it's dead. And so therefore it's like in quantum error correction, one of the challenges is how do you perform even a measurement that looks at the state and judges whether an error has occurred without destroying the state that you were actually wanting to try to preserve through that. So you need to find a clever way how to go about that, because measurements usually collapse quantum superposition states. And so here the trick is that is used is that one stores the quantum information in a logical qubit, and that logical qubit is distributed over the many physical qubits, the red dots in this picture here, and then you come up with a clever way to store all the quantum information in these red dots, making use of a symmetry property of the red dots. And the symmetry property will be the parity of the state, of the quantum state, encoded in the red dots. So the red dots will all be zeros and ones, yeah. And for example, if you encode quantum information in a situation where there will be an even number of ones in this register of 25 red data qubits here, then you could check whether that number of data qubits in the one state stays even or changes to odd. For example, if it's even initially and there's an error on one of those qubits, yeah, that one qubit will go from 1 to 0, and now there's an odd number of ones rather than an even number of ones. And so interestingly, what you will then do is you will try to encode your logical qubit in data qubit states which all have even parity, which all have an even number of ones in them. And then when you measure, are there an even number of ones, you can check whether an error occurred, but you will know nothing about the logical state that you have encoded. And I'll give examples for that. All right, so So the approach that we took for realizing this experiment is the surface code. It's been invented by Alexei Kitaev, and there's lots of history to it. So he was inspired by certain things that he learned also from topological features of these systems, but maybe I'll not say very much about it. What is special about the surface code is that it's an encoding for quantum information that works on qubits, and you can lay out these qubits in a planar lattice, like what you see here. So if you make qubits on a chip or so, that's good news, because if some theorist comes up and says, oh, you need to encode your qubits in some hypersphere or some torus or so, you maybe don't know how you will realize your qubits in a connectivity that is on a torus. So this is on a planar lattice. And what is also special is that in case errors occur, and I've not told you yet how you would notice that an error occurred, nor how you would fix it, you can actually correct for these errors by local processes. So you could check out where did the error occur, and then you can do something at the location where the error actually occurred and fix it that way, rather than doing something complicated on a whole set of qubits. And the other thing that is very good about the surface code is there's many other error correction codes for quantum information processing, and you can compare them against each other essentially by looking at how tolerant they are to physical errors in your hardware. Yeah? And the surface code is the one code that has the highest tolerance to errors in the physical hardware. So it's still the best known code that you can have that tolerates the highest level of errors in your hardware. And that defines a so-called threshold. And in a maybe somewhat simplified model, this threshold is about 1% error in every component of the hardware that you use for implementing the surface code. So what that means is if everything on your hardware is better than 1% error, you'll probably make this surface code work, and in the end, it's a benefit for the quantum computer. And initially, the early codes were way worse than that, or so maybe they had a threshold of 0.001%, and that would mean, oh, your hardware has to get even much better than it is now to even start trying to implement error correction in this encoding. So that's why surface code is important, and I think it will be for anyone who lays out their qubits in a planar lattice, so spins or superconducting circuits, they will need to look at this type of code. And there's nothing better currently. Good, so what are the elements of the surface code? So I told you, so there's a lattice here with 25 data qubits or code qubits in a 5x5 grid. So that's called a distance 5 surface code. Maybe you'll see later where it has this name from. And then there's these blue and green auxiliary qubits that you see here. And these gray bars that you see between the blue and green qubits and the surrounding data qubits, these define a so-called plaquette. So let's maybe look at this set of data qubits here. So there's 4 data qubits that are linked by a gray bar to this Z-type auxiliary qubit. And this Z-type auxiliary qubit is actually used to measure the parity of the 4 data qubits that it connects to on such a little square here, which is called a plaquette. And one way, if you're a theorist and you like to think about it this way, one thing that you can think this Z auxiliary qubit to measure is the product of the Pauli Z operators of these 4 data qubits that lie around it. But maybe that's not the most intuitive thing, but maybe a more intuitive thing is to say that this Z-type qubit, it tries to determine whether an even number of data qubits are in the state 1 or not. And I'll give you a basic example for that in a second. All right, so here's the auxiliary qubit, the Z-type one. And then there's 4 data qubits that are coupled to it in this plaquette. And we try to figure out this parity by applying some gates to this between the data qubits and this auxiliary qubit. And what you essentially do is you run 4 2-qubit gates that are known as C0 gates. So these are the symbols for C0 gates. Subsequently, between first data qubit, second data qubit, third and fourth, and this auxiliary qubit. And that allows you to to see from the state of this auxiliary qubit whether the data qubits were in an even parity. And on the next slide, I'll show you a specific example for that. So in a quantum computer, since there are not only bit flip errors, but also phase flip errors, that's not good enough. So you need to do that also for these phase factors, for the plus and minus ones. And luckily, this is very easy to do because it's essentially almost the same. Yeah, you see here it's this, the product of 4 X operators. So you take another plaquette here. There's, again, 4 neighbors. And you try to measure this. And it essentially works in the same way as here. The only thing that you have to do is you have to kind of do a basis transformation on your data qubits. So you apply a pi-half pulse to every one of your data qubits initially, and that flips the basis. So everything that was a north pole is now on a superposition state, and vice versa. And then the same gate sequence now measures the parity, so that whether there's an even number of pluses, but in this other basis. Okay, and so what the quantum computer does in the surface code when it does error correction, it essentially all the time measures these parities. It tries to look at all the time, is there an even number of ones and an even number of pluses all the time. Yeah? And for that to work successfully, you have to make sure that the errors that are introduced by doing these 2-qubit gates, the single qubit gates, and this measurement on this auxiliary qubit that you need to perform to figure out whether an error has occurred or not, these all have to be pretty good. And that's this threshold that I mentioned. So every one of these operations needs to be at least with an error not larger than 1%. And if that's the case, yeah, then this has a chance of succeeding and making the logical qubit better than the physical qubits. And this is challenging. For example, in this example from the Google quantum advantage work, there you saw the readout had 4% error, and therefore with that readout, they would probably not get this surface code to work well enough to actually be successful. Good, so here's my basic example. So how does this work as a parity measurement? So I told you a parity measurement means an even number of ones in your data qubit register. And here I did the even simpler example, not with 4 data qubits, but with 2. So if you start with your helper auxiliary qubit in the ground state, and now you apply 2 C0s subsequently between the data qubit and the auxiliary qubit. So every time the data qubit is in 1, the auxiliary qubit will flip the state from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0 when this gate gets enacted. So when both of the data qubits are in 1, the auxiliary qubit goes from 0 to 1 and then back from 1 to 0. So effectively it remains where it was. And that indicates that the parity was even, so there's an even number of ones. And now you could imagine, say if you had more data qubits, like 4, and all of them are in 1, or then the auxiliary qubit goes 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, and be back where it was, and that indicates that you have an even parity state. And when the data qubits are in state 0, these C0 gates do nothing. Yeah? They don't even act on the auxiliary qubit. But say if now, say one of the ones turns into a 0, like here, or one of the zeros turns into a 1, now you have an odd number of 2-qubit C0 gates that act on this auxiliary qubit, and therefore your auxiliary qubit goes from 0 to 1. And that tells you, hey, there was an error. So now your parity has changed from even to odd. And the trick is really encode all your quantum information in even parity states and use these auxiliary qubit stabilizer measurements to figure out whether the parity has changed. Yeah? And that's what it's about. Good. All right, so there's one sort of basic example. So I showed you before, you saw this big grid with 25 data qubits. So here's a tiny grid with 4 data qubits and 3 auxiliary qubits. And here you can, so there's these, you measure parities in the X and in the Z basis. And here's this product of these parity operators are written down here. And maybe you don't need to worry about that, but they all commute with each other, and the fact that they commute means that they have common eigenstates. Yeah? And here's some examples of these common eigenstates. So actually, in such a device, you would now encode the logical 0 as the superposition 4 zeros with 4 ones. So that's clearly an even parity state. So now you can turn that into a logical 1 by flipping, say, 2 of the qubits, say the first and the third one. And if you flip the first and the third one from either a 0 to a 1 or from a 1 into a 0, you end up with this logical excited state. And you look at it and you see there's still an even number of 1s. So that's still an even parity state. So your parity measurement will not be able to tell, are you in a 0 or are you in a 1? And that's exactly what you want. So then if you want a logical superposition state, you just make a superposition of 0 logical and 1 logical, and you look at it and you see still every component has an even parity. And minus superposition state you can create by, for example, every time you have only one of the first 2 qubits in the 1 state, you flip its phase, and that creates this logical minus. And you look at it, so now there's 4 distinct states that you encode your quantum information in, but they're all even parity. Yeah, I guess now you got it. Yeah? So this is how this works, and you extend that to larger and larger sets of qubits. You do the same approach with 9 qubits or with 25 or with larger sets of qubits to encode quantum information. And so the experiment that we were happy with having done is to do this on this 3 by 3 data qubit lattice, and so there's 9 data qubits here, and so this is actually the d is called the distance of a surface code, and that also relates to the number of operators that you need to change the state of the logical qubit encoded in this surface code. So here if you want to change a logical 0 to a logical 1, you need to apply 3 local Pauli Z operators to 3 of these data qubits. So in this case, if you apply a Z operator to D1, D2, D3, you will change the phase of the logical state. If you apply an X operator to X1, X4, and X7, you will flip the logical 0 to a logical 1. And now if I could write down the states for you, like as in the 2 by 2 example, but that will sort of quickly get difficult to look at. And then if you're maybe a theorist and understand about commutators and so on, it's probably easier to understand it that way than looking exactly at the states and writing them down. All right, in this case, there's 8 of these auxiliary qubits. You can also figure out how many. There always need to be d squared, so the distance squared minus 1 auxiliary qubits. And from the distance, you can also check how many simultaneous errors you are able to correct. And so this distance 3 surface code with 9 data qubits, it is the smallest instance that can correct 1 error. So if you want to correct more simultaneous errors, you need more qubits. For example, this distance 5 lattice with 25 data qubits, it can detect and correct for 2 simultaneous errors always. No. Good, so there's these auxiliary qubits. You do these parity or stabilizer measurements, and there's kind of commutation properties and that you can look at. And you can write down these stabilizers, which are products of these Pauli Z and X operators here, and there's 8 different of them. And sort of in the center of the surface code, there are weight 4 operators, and there are some at the edge or so, yeah, where you see like these qubits here, these auxiliary qubits here, they're only coupled to 2 neighboring data qubits, and so those are weight 2. Good, and then you try to build this thing in hardware. So this is what a chip looks like, and at this stage, I always say that you should feel privileged to be able to look at this, because I don't think there's any other lab that I've seen that would let you look at their 17-qubit chip or so. Yeah, so I think Google's chip you've still not seen, and yeah. And so now here you can look at one. So the yellow structures are the superconducting qubits. They are laid out in a square lattice, like the dots on my schematic. So every qubit you can control with a microwave transmission line that is shown in purple here, to which you hook up a piece of instrumentation from your favorite manufacturer to apply short microwave pulses to it. Then there is green lines here through which you apply short DC pulses that are needed for doing 2-qubit gates, these logical gates that I've mentioned, the 2-qubit, the C0 gates between the data qubits and the auxiliary qubits are realized by applying voltage pulses to these green lines here, again with the instrumentation from your favorite manufacturer. Then there's blue connections between the yellow qubits, and these blue connections, they mediate interactions. So you can only do 2-qubit gates between pairs that are connected by these blue lines. All these lines that I've colored for you here are coplanar waveguide structures on this device. Everything is quite large, so you see a scale bar up here. And maybe then one aspect that is very special about our chip and which maybe helped us to do this experiment before IBM and Google and anyone else is that we had a very good readout for our superconducting qubits, and that gets done by hooking up a microwave frequency resonator to it with a Purcell filter, and there's some frequency multiplexed feed line that is able to read out multiple qubits at the same time. And so in today's talk, I've somehow chosen to rather explain to you the concept rather than how that works on the hardware level on a chip. So if you had another hour in the end, I could maybe give you some more ideas about that, but I rather thought I'd keep it with the concept. And the reason why this worked for us first is the fact that this readout is really working very well, and we've been developing that quite a bit in our lab since 6 years ago or so, and Philip Corpius was involved in the first steps of that. Okay, so here now, if you stare at this a little bit, you see that there's these plaquettes, and the data qubits sit on the vertices of the plaquettes, and the stabilizer measurement qubits sit in the centers of these plaquettes. And so now you associate this picture that you've seen before with the layout on the chip. All right, so here's the chip. So things are large, as I mentioned. So you see the structures on the chip, even under the microscope here. There's a kind of a custom-made microwave frequency sample mount with 48 connectors on it. So this you package in a microwave-tight and radiation-tight enclosure with some shielding. You put it into a big dilution refrigerator with even more shielding and magnetic shielding here, and all your microwave signal conditioning things, circulators, amplifiers, and so forth. And then you hook up your favorite electronics to it. So this is one of the cryostats that we use, and here you see our favorite electronics currently, also down there. And also other electronics from the last generation that was much more bulky. So we tend to be using the type of stuff on the left-hand side. And you see that it starts to get sort of a bit messy. So this is all the electronics that you need for 17 qubits for one logical qubit. Yeah, and so maybe there you also see that, okay, if you want 1 million logical qubits, you probably will not multiply that by 10 to the 6. And so there's more work to do. So this is a bit more cleaned up setup at our new lab at PSI with kind of more modern versions of the same electronics from your favorite manufacturer. And then you try to make that work, and it's actually quite hard to make it work well. And of course, nothing in science, nothing ever stands on its own. So there was lots of previous work on this and the different steps. So there were different steps for first correcting only these X or Z errors, so bit flips or phase flips simultaneously, or only that error but not the other one. Then there were experiments in which both errors were corrected but only once. Yeah? But in a quantum error corrected system, you need to correct it continuously, so you need to check for errors always. So then there was a repeated error detection experiment, also one from our lab, in which the device was large enough to notice whether errors had occurred, but you couldn't tell where. Yeah? So this thing tells you, oh, the parity has changed, but you need to look at these parity measurements and tell, okay, which one of the 49 qubits actually had the error on it, and you need to decode that. And so then at the end of last year, or in the middle of last year, there was actually an ion trap experiment by Honeywell, and then there was our experiment, an experiment from Zhanwei Pan's group in China, and then also an IBM experiment in March this year that realized a so-called distance 3 quantum error correction code in a logical qubit. Good. So the key element is this parity measurement. So I'll say a few words about this parity measurement, and then with that we can then get to the final results of it. So this parity measurement I mentioned, you have these plaquettes here. So there's 4 data qubits, the red dots, with an auxiliary qubit in the center, and you run this gate sequence where you run 2 qubit gates between the data qubits and the auxiliary qubit, and so this is, in our actual hardware, it's implemented a little bit differently because our actual hardware doesn't implement C0 gates, but C phase gates. But okay, you can ignore that for the moment. So the symbol here is a little bit different, but it's essentially equivalent. And you can do the same thing in the not only for the Z arrows, so in the green plaquettes, but also for the X arrows in the blue plaquettes by doing this basis change that I mentioned to you. And then there's a sort of a trick that helped us is you do some echo pulses in the middle of the sequence that helps us to improve the quality of our gates. Okay, so now there's my one electronics slide. So there's another zoom in of the stack of electronics here. So that has these has HDAWGs, which we use to tune the transition frequencies. So that applies voltage pulses to our qubits to tune the transition frequencies. And what we do for doing 2 qubit gates, we tune neighboring qubits into resonance with each other and then detune them again. And that gets done with these boxes here. Then there is another set of these boxes which are fed, the signals of which are fed into a mixer that has microwave sources connected to it, which were made in this house, I think, or at least designed in this house. Then there is boxes with FPGAs inside that detect the measurement signals that read out our stabilizers on this, which help us to identify where the errors have occurred. And then there's sort of up and down conversion electronics that here we're still in a demo version that was assembled in our lab, but where you can also now have a box from this manufacturer if you like. And then there's some synchronization between these boxes with this yellow box at the bottom. All right, and then so you make this all work, and it takes a while, and then you see whether your stabilizer measurements do work. And sort of the basic thing that you're trying to do is, so I claim to you that this measurement, this gate sequence, it can distinguish whether there is an even number of zeros and ones in your state or not. And that should be when there's an even number of ones, then your stabilizer or your parity measurement should indicate a 1, and when the number is odd, it should indicate a -1. And so now you can go through this list at the bottom here and check whether there's a sort of a 1 every time there's an even number of ones, and a -1 when that number is odd. And you look at this, and you see it works, and this quotes the error, and the error is not tiny, it's kind of, I mean, it's sizable. The error on it is a few percent. So one thing that I also didn't say is like every 2 qubit error on this device is roughly 1%. So you do 4 2 qubit gates in a sequence, and the single qubits have also a little bit of error, and there's a little bit of measurement error, and so that accumulates. So you will have a little bit of error in this parity measurement, but the surface code told you that some error is okay. It can recover from some error as long as that's not large enough. And since there's now not 1 stabilizer but 8, we did go through all these measurements, and then you could sort of stare at it for a while and verify that it's always 1 when the parity is even and -1 when the parity is odd. And we can also roughly understand how good it is, which is the comparison to the red outlines. Good, so that's probably roughly at the stage where one loses the audience because it gets subsequently more and more complicated. So here's the gate sequence that you execute on this distance 3 surface code for 1 one error correction cycle. Yeah? So you have to do all this stuff to correct errors for one cycle. And any quantum computer that is error corrected will have to do something like that every sort of effective clock cycle or error correction cycle. So there were two types of parities that you measure in the Z basis and in the X basis, and we do all the gates for the Z basis parity measurements first, and then we do all the gates for the X basis parity measurements second. And maybe the special thing in our setup, and the one that sets us apart from IBM and Google and others, was that these readouts are very fast. So the length of the readout is less than the cumulated length of the gates for doing the stabilizers. And at IBM, for example, this readout is maybe 5 times longer. So, and then even if you have better coherence qubits, it doesn't help because your whole thing will last too long. So you need to realize good readout on your auxiliary qubits, because that's what you look at to verify whether you had even or odd parity in your devices. Good, and then you program all the software on your electronics to apply this pulse sequence and see whether that works. You run it on to prepare this logical 0, logical 1, and the superposition states, which I've mentioned. And this whole cycle for us now takes about a microsecond. And okay, there's some detail about leakage, which I think is very, very important, but I'll not bother you with. And what is maybe also interesting to say, if you now count number of gates, so we've executed this cycle for up to 16 times, then you see that there's about 800 single qubit gates and about 400 2-qubit gates. So in complexity-wise, it starts to be on the same scale as this quantum advantage or quantum supremacy experiment that Google did a while back. Okay, so maybe to leave some time for the questions, I would likely skip this slide and not explain the details. So this is essentially about, now you compare how your single qubit would decay from the excited to the ground state, and now you do this complicated thing with all the encoding and the error correction, and you now look at how your logical qubit decays from the excited state to the ground state, and you can extract that decay time if you want. Okay, maybe one thing I should still say. And the decay time, so one of the aspects that matters is how does this decay time that you extract from these curves here, which is like this energy relaxation time and the dephasing time that I mentioned in the beginning, how does that compare to the cycle time, the time that you need to run one error correction cycle? And the relationship between these two numbers will tell you how much error you make during one cycle. And that's what's on the next slide, which I maybe then explain a bit better. So from the curves on the previous slide, you can correct how the error accumulates in your logical qubit, both in the Z basis and in the X basis. And so here's how the logical error accumulates. So once you continue running your error correction cycle, your accumulated error gets worse and worse, which is not surprising. Things decay with time, even when you're trying to correct errors. But from these curves, you can now extract how much error there is per cycle, per one round of error correction. And in our case, this is about 3%. And this is kind of interesting to notice. Yeah, so this is built up from 24 2-qubit gates, which have 1.5% error each, and which accumulates. But with evaluating your errors from the measurements that you do on using these auxiliary qubits, you can correct for these errors to get the logical error rate to be only on the order of 3%. And so now you could, so first maybe you could ask yourself, how good is that in comparison to other distance 3 surface codes? And as mentioned just after us, Jean-Y Pan's group put a paper on the archive that discussed their results. There's this work by Honeywell, and there's now work by IBM since March. And so here's this error per cycle, and so our experiment has a lower error per cycle than both the other superconducting qubit experiments. It has a little bit higher error per cycle than a Honeywell experiment. But then you look at the ions, and at some stage, wall time will also matter, and the ion experiment is very, very slow, and the main reason for that is that you need to do individual measurements on the ions which store the error information, and in the ion traps you have to sort of move the ions physically around somewhere else so that while you do the measurement it doesn't destroy the information stored in the data qubits. And that makes their experiment essentially 5 orders of magnitude slower. And so maybe at the, like, as long as you talk about normalized quantities, maybe you don't care so much, but once wall time will matter or so, yeah, and like whether you have a factor of 10 to the 5 in front of some duration for your algorithm will likely matter. Okay, and so then finally, how good is 0.03 error per cycle? Yeah, that's clearly way worse than you would need for a real processor. And so what we chose to compare it to is to compare it to an error rate that would be relevant when you're trying to do gates between 2 logical qubits. So the next step would be you take 2 of these things, 2 times 17 qubits, or maybe a few more, because there's a little bit of overhead, and you would run logical gates between 2 logical qubits. And maybe in the simplest to consider case there, what would matter if you can do transverse logical 2-qubit gates, which I don't expect you to understand what that means immediately, but maybe some of you do. If you could do transverse gates, what matters is the physical 2-qubit gate error. And so we see that the logical error per cycle is about twice the physical 2-qubit gate error. And this you can actually use to, and no worries, I'm sort of finished now so that there's some time to take questions. So you could use that to ask yourself, like, how close are you to some form of break even? Yeah? In the end, what you want is you want your logical qubit to be better than your physical qubit. And there's various senses in which you could discuss that, either as a memory qubit or when you want to do gates between 2 logical qubits. And so in the end, I think our experiment is pretty close to this break even, but it's not really better than this break even. You could now say, oh, this is disappointing. So why did you do that? So a colleague of mine on Twitter said, oh, you made a logical qubit and it's worse than your physical qubits. So, but okay, good. We think it was hard enough. We worked at it 6 years. We were pretty happy that it worked at all. And I think IBM and Google would also have been happy if they had done it already. So this is close to the threshold. But not, so what is important, maybe that's not very far. Yeah? It's not a factor of 100 away where you would think you would now need another 6 years to get it across this threshold. And so we're thinking we're pretty close. Also, the threshold is something variable. You want to, in the end, you want to be much, much better than the threshold, not just close to the threshold. So there's even more work for everyone. And there's more analysis that you can do to verify that. Okay, so to sum it up, so we've done this distance 3 surface code. I hope I told you a little bit about what that is and how it works. It has a fast quantum error correction cycle. It has a it has a small logical error rate. Yeah, if you're in the first year of doing this, yeah, then it's always kind of small because there's no other logical error rates for distance 3 code from anyone else at that stage. And this break even is within reach. And the next thing that we want to do is if we have electronics with low latency or so, we can do feedback and resets, for example, and then we would look into doing logical gates between logical qubits and maybe seeing how resilient these logical qubits are to injecting noise into our devices to see how they respond to artificially increasing the background noise level. And I should mention once more, so this is a picture of the experimental part of the team. It has everyone but missing Christopher Eichler on this one. There's a list with the theorists again. And yeah, it mentioned once more that really everyone here contributed throughout many years to that project. And yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And on the next slide, there's a picture that we took sometime last summer with everyone who was currently at our lab and was going to be at our lab next term, also all the undergraduate and master level students. All right, so thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Andreas, for this really great talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm sure there are a few questions still open. Daniel, wait a second, we need the microphone.
I have a question about decoding. So for the distance 3...
I said nothing about decoding. So.
Right, so yeah, so for distance 3, I guess you can do a lookup table. But how would that scale if you actually go to proper surface code with a larger distance? As far as I know, minimum weight perfect matching doesn't really run on FPGA. Is there anything on that?
Yeah, it's very hard. Yeah, so I think then doing. So I said nothing about decoders there. So in the end, what you essentially do is you look at all these auxiliary qubits, which look at the parities. In our case, there were 8 of them, and you look at which one of the 8 ones indicated an error, and you do that for every time step. And if you don't have 8, but 24, for example, and if your distance grows, this gets a complicated computational task in itself. Yeah? And the question is, how do you solve that? And yeah, there's people thinking from the theory side about how to do that, and maybe how you could simplify the decoder to be good enough. Yeah? And still not excessively expensive to run. Yeah? That's a fair question. So my next step, difficult problems on the experimental side are, I find there's harder ones than that one for me, and so I don't think too hard about it. But theorists do think about it, and there's there's, for example, a group in Cologne that thinks about how to simplify the problem enough. So maybe just run the decoder on a subset of the whole cell and see how good you can get. And there's also people who think about doing various decoders and see which ones do better than others. And the computationally more demanding ones typically do better, but they cost more, and so this is also, that's maybe one other way how this could fail. Yeah, so if you can't make a good enough fast decoder that looks at the errors in your quantum computer. Fair point.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Are there other questions at the moment? Malai, you have a question? Maybe also for everybody participating virtually, if you have a question, please type them in. We will take them over. Malai, please go ahead.
Thank you for your talk, Professor Wallraff. So this is a substantially large experiment with real-time error detection going on. Did you observe any rare events of correlated errors due to cosmic rays and so on? Thank you.
That's also a very good question. It also gets asked always now, because there were some in the experiments at Google. There were some indications that there were correlated errors. So one of the reasons how this can work is if there's not too many simultaneous errors on any of the components. Yeah? And if you have something disastrous happening locally, for example, I don't know. Some high energy particle hitting your device and creating disturbances locally, then it could lead to errors, to an accumulation of errors at a certain instance in time over some space, and that would destroy your ability to actually correct for that error. I think we don't have as many chips as Google has, and we've probably, our accumulated measurement time was less than theirs. But so far we hadn't seen anything that is obvious on that level. Why could that be? I don't know. I think people started to look at whether there's more natural radioactivity around Santa Barbara, for example, than in Zurich. I think they used to work in essentially an aluminum container or so, while we're in a proper Swiss concrete building. So maybe that matters. I think it's interesting. So there were people who tried to put radioactive materials next to their devices and see the impact of it, and they saw the impact of it, and that type of phenomenon matters. And could it matter, like if you now build a large-scale quantum computer and you don't want it to be limited by cosmic rays or so? That's also a concern. But we have, at the moment, we have nothing to say about it from the experimental side. I think this type of problem should be there at some level, and how important is it? It's kind of difficult to say. Switzerland also has very big mountains, and I know people who do experiments in tunnels that the Swiss army has drilled through all the big Swiss mountains. So I think we would have a good position for our quantum computer as well.
Good. Thanks a lot. I think there's another question in the very front.
Yeah,
thank you for a very nice talk. My question is, what is the dominant kind of error that you see? Is it phase noise from the control electronics, or is it crosstalk between readout lines?
Yeah, in our car, the dominant error currently is our 2-qubit gates. They're the worst single part in our device, and the 2-qubit gate error currently is dominated by surface defects. And so these surface defects, it's an ensemble of likely microscopic in origin defects, and those microscopic defects, because there's many of them and they are all over in energy or so, some of them tend to couple strongly to the qubits, and those who are then most strongly coupled to the qubits, they really adversely affect the 2-qubit gate fidelities. And so my feeling is, if we didn't have those, we would probably have done the experiment maybe, I don't know, half a year earlier or so, and the overall performance would be better. So I think currently it's we're working on improving our fabrication techniques to mitigate that some, and hope that we can gain kind of the 2-qubit gate fidelity to get across this threshold, for example. So it's at the moment, I would say at the level that we're at, it's something that we need to fix, and otherwise we'll tell the manufacturers of our electronics to improve it.
Good. With that, let's hope that the manufacturer of your electronics hears that. Are there other additional questions? I don't see any at the moment. So with that, I would close the session and all talks for today. Let's thank Andreas and all speakers again. So with this, we close the virtual event for today. We will come back tomorrow with additional keynotes and the panel. And now is on the agenda for everybody here. We have the poster session outside, set up in the atrium. And after the poster session, or kind of directly moving into, we will have the dinner being served outside. I think this is an excellent possibility to talk again to all the speakers today, and get in touch with everybody else from Rohde & Schwarz and Zurich Instruments if you want. Thanks a lot, and thanks for your attention, and to all speakers for being really on time over the entire day. This was really helpful. Thanks.